We have a lot of things that seem to confirm the idea of continuity and linearity. But as people know, if we look at continuity and change in the Gilded Ages of the bubbles, the canal mania, the railway mania, the London global markets in the roaring 20s, and then we look at the crises that created destruction, and then we look at the next golden ages, you see this kind of transformation that takes place. It's a transformation that belies or points out that even though we can have some indicators, like I said, of aggregate continuity, underneath that aggregate continuity is hugely complex systemic change in human societies. What we do it and how we do it changes. So thinking about change a little bit more, there's the way to think about change in terms of substitution, where a stop sign is replaced by a stoplight. That's direct substitution type change. There's complementarity, where the telephone, people thought that the telephone might reduce human contact, but it turns out that it's the opportunity for people to call each other and go, and there's a complementarity, and they both go up together. And there's the emergence of novelty, where something like the Model T Ford gives rise to the suburb. I mean, we all have stories, right, from technology, because it's easy to have these stories, where we talk about how the tool was initially thought to play a different role. So, for instance, some of the inventors of the telephone believed that the telephone would be used for concerts, to broadcast concerts to the home. Why? Because they didn't think of this expensive, complicated technology as a point-to-point tool, a tool for communicating from one home to another. They thought of it as a very expensive, elaborate way to allow people to listen to the opera in their home, which was, of course, a big advance. So the emergent nature of these phenomena, they're novel. So can we think about changes in the conditions of change? And this is, again, a critical question. It's already come up here at the meeting. How do we get better at thinking about changes in the conditions of change? So change within the system, change outside the system, inside in change, outside in change, inside out, and outside out. And let me point out that I think it's fairly clear that the strategic, when you're talking about strategic options, strategic choices, it's not the tactics within a strategy. It's not how to improve an existing system. It's the question of what's the relationship between an existing system and an emergent system. But it's really quite difficult to identify systems, and even more difficult to identify emergent systems. So this work that we do around futures literacy is meant to make it easier for us to begin to identify systemic boundaries and to be able to distinguish between systemic boundaries that are in conflict or in contradiction or exogenous to existing systems and those that are not, so that we can make strategic choices. So again, it's part of the question of how to deal with making choices, but understanding better how to define the menu and then make choices. So once again, let me emphasize the distinction here between search and choice. Under setting the menu, it's not the same as choosing on the menu. Here we're primarily talking about how do we figure out what is on the menu, how do we put things on the menu. Choices will be made in many, many different ways, from the gut, from power, from happenstance, by mistake, in all sorts of ways. So the problem with the future is it reinforces the fear of uncertainty in the current context. It biases us to seek past dependency. It has a fetishism of immortality. It has a preoccupation with endogenous continuous improvement and reform. So many times when we're brought in, okay, so look, we're talking about futures literacy for Africa. Many times when people say, oh, you're going to come and talk to me about the future, they're going to think that you're going to help kill uncertainty, you're going to help them determine a path, which will be the right path, and that they'll then only look at that path, that therefore their citadel or their company or their country will last forever, will be immortal, and that they can continuously improve the existing system and pay no attention to the external because they don't want to or get frightened. So we have a problem. It creates this false sense of temporality. And when we, very often when I go into places and say, let's talk about the future, people say, oh, so now this gives me the permission to let go of my assumptions. But they say, if it's 2 years, I can't let go of my assumptions. If it's 10 years or 100 years, yes, I can do that. It's the permission to not forecast from a predictive risk perspective in a closed context, but it liberates their imagination in a very limited way. Because it's only liberating their imagination to extrapolate from their existing model. Because look, it's really unfair to ask people to imagine the future without equipping them with some tools, without giving them some practice. If I ask you to paint a painting, unless you're an artist and you have the practice, you won't be able to do it. So when we ask people to think about the future, we have to provide them with the process so that they are able to do so. And particularly if we want them to understand what's inside the box and what's outside the box. And please I'm not saying inside the box is bad and outside the box is better. It's not a question of better or worse. It's a question of being scientific. Both of them exist. There are things around us today that we do not understand, that we do not have names for. We should just try to take those things into account. And it gives us this capacity to understand the world around us. Foresight methods are mostly limited to one view of how to use the future. For preparation and planning, it's closed. Rarely imagining other conceptions of agency. This is another important issue. Very often when we design futures exercises, people are in a big hurry to get to the make a difference, right? And because they're in such a big hurry to make a difference, they don't look for things that are not directly within their control. Because they say, after all, if I can push the button, tell me when I should push the button. And I want to push the button, and I want to push it many, many times and see what happens out there. That's fine, but there's lots of other things that we could do, and lots of other ways of thinking about change. And there's also the really crucial way, which is realizing that the conditions of change. And what we can do today is not something, tomorrow we can do something that we cannot do today. You can do something different in a world where everybody has a cell phone, or where everybody can read and write, than in a situation where only a small number of people can read and write, and only a small number of people have a cell phone. So one of the key issues here about futures literacy is to move beyond the hold of the past and the thinking of the present. It's to try and create a better relationship across these tyrannies that we've been talking about, is to understand the relationships amongst them and to be more effective in the way in which we use the future. Because we do use the future all the time. To come to this meeting, to go across the street, to go to university, whatever it happens to be. If we care about policy, we care about policy because of the future. If we think about climate change, it's because we care about the future. So we're using the future all the time. But to what extent do we diversify our approach from the idea that we must impose our idea of the future on the future to taking a more open, more diversified way of thinking? So that's the key issue here. How do we know what we do not know? A role for social science. I've said this before. What we see and do in the present depends heavily on what we imagine in the future. Use the future to discover the present, to grasp novelty, emergent, and systemic boundaries. So I hope that that's clear for everybody, that this is the purpose of the futures literacy process. So I'm just going to do a quick run-through on what is futures literacy, sort of more formally, because I've been mentioning it, but I think now quite a few of you have seen parts of this before, maybe more than one at a time. Here we go. What is futures literacy? So futures literacy is the capacity to tell anticipatory stories using rigorous imagining based on sharing depth of knowledge from across the community. Futures literacy is a way to internalize the constant development of our understanding of the potential of the present and of changing anticipatory assumptions. So it's a sort of long definition, fairly detailed, but I hope you see what I'm trying to get at, which is that it gives us a greater ability to understand the present and to use the richness of the present. Um,